I'm going to wait and see if anyone joins us besides you and I. I'll wait 5 minutes to see if anyone else comes on. And then I'll update you in 5 minutes. This is Keira. Just to give you an update, I was just waiting to see if more of the participants would be joining us because it was to begin just myself and my colleague Maya. So if you don't mind, I'm going to continue waiting maybe just a few minutes to start with the content. started. Thank you for being so patient, Angelina and Maya. So thank you for taking the time also to join me this morning. I just want to check and see that you can hear me okay. You can just type in the chat yes or no. Yes. Okay, perfect. Great. All right. So we'll just jump right in since I already had you wait about 5 minutes. And I need to get a few messages from headquarters out there for you to know. So the presentation you're about to view is the intellectual property of D&D. Any reproduction or retransmission of the slides is strictly forbidden. And some of the topics discussed in this webinar might be of sensitive nature and not appropriate for children, so we ask for parental discretion. On that note, I'd like to add that this presentation is about dietary fats, so it does not include any sensitive or triggering topics as some of our social wellness webinars would. So don't be concerned about having to use much parental discretion during this session. Thirdly, please understand that people's stories are theirs alone to tell, and anything that's shared by participants in the webinar is not to be discussed outside the webinar. Again, that's more pertaining to our social wellness webinars. And finally, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing later on our website, calfconnection.ca. And I do encourage you to participate. However, you can simply choose to follow along in the chat if you'd prefer that. So a few housekeeping items. Angelina, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit for a moment, but is this your first time in a Demio web session? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little orientation. It's a pretty simple but useful platform. So right now, you're obviously using the chat function, which is great. So you can continue to use that if you have any questions or you want to give answers to any questions I might ask you. And if I don't get to it during the webinar for any reason, I will get to it at the end. If you have a question, I'll make sure I go through and address anything that you type in there. The other thing to note, at the top of the chat box, you can see it says polls next to the chat, and that's where I'll be asking questions to the audience, and you can just vote your answer, which would remain anonymous, so no one will know what you answered. So we're going to use the poll function next, actually, and I just want to also note that since the sessions are being recorded, that includes everything in the chat, so it's just something to be mindful of. Not really too concerned right now because there's only 2 of you. But to start with the poll, I already shared it, and it's a simple question just to ask what your affiliation is with the Canadian Armed Forces community. So you would just click the poll tab at the top of your chat box, and then you select the answer. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Serving member, veteran, family member, civilian, or other. So Maya, did you see the chat? You can't see it, the poll. I shared it at the beginning, but it's okay if you can't see it right now. We'll just mark that you're a civilian employee. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the content. So to start off, we'll do a little test your knowledge section, and it's really just to see what your current knowledge and understanding is of dietary fats. Oh, you found it. Perfect, Maya. Thank you. And it's just so that I can get a feel for what you might already know, and the questions are a really great intro to the material that I'll be presenting to you during the webinar. And after that, we'll discuss what fat actually is in terms of nutrition, why it's important, and then we will review cholesterol and its positive and negative impacts on our health and its ties with fats or triglycerides. And then we'll identify the different types of fats, their sources, the benefits, and the health consequences of each type of fat. And then I'll leave you with some nutrition guidelines that are pretty specific to fats in our diets. And that's to provide you with some direction moving forward for, establishing healthy eating patterns and habits. So before we do the quiz, I think it's important to outline the different types of nutrients that our bodies need to function optimally and to survive. So to simplify the discussion of nutrients, they've been divided into 6 categories. The first one we like to list off as water because it's coined as the forgotten nutrient, and it's actually the one that we need the most. Our bodies, as is common knowledge sometimes, is that they're made 60% of water, and we need that for almost every function in our body. Second, third, and fourth would be the macronutrients: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And those are the nutrients that can be used as energy, and we need them in large amounts. So that's why they're called macronutrients. It means we need those nutrients in large amounts. Then 5 and 6 would be vitamins and minerals, which are the 2 micronutrients, so they're needed in small amounts. And evidently, today we're going to be focusing on fat. And it's recommended by Dietitians of Canada and Health Canada that 20 to 35% of your total energy intake, or the calories from the foods you eat, should come from fats every day. And that's equivalent to 65 to 90 grams of fat per day, based on if you're eating 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day, which is quite common for the average person. And that is what should comprise a third of your diet. Basically, is not a third, but 20 to 35% of your daily intake should come from fat. So keeping that in mind, we're going to move on to the test your knowledge. So this is mostly going to be comprised, this is all polls. So I'm going to share basically 8 questions with you, and we'll go through them. Oh, I apologize there. And it's just to get you thinking a little more about the topic. Maybe it'll awaken some dusty corners of your brain on things you already know, and maybe you'll learn something new right away. I'm not going to discuss the answers or go into details of each question on each slide, but they will be addressed during the presentation for sure. So the first question is, this fat is solid at room temperature. So I just shared the question. So if you go to your poll function, and you can just click the answer that you think is correct. And again, it's anonymous, so I can't see who answered what. And if you don't want to, you don't have to. So just trying to see, this fat is solid at room temperature. Oh, we have 3 people joining us. Perfect. So great. I see we've got a couple here saying saturated fat. Someone did respond trans fat as well, and they're not totally wrong. And we will go into detail on trans fat later on. But in general, for the most part, saturated fat is the one that's solid at room temperature. The next question we have, this fat is liquid at room temperature. So I will just add this here. Perfect. So this fat is liquid at room temp. So obviously it's not saturated fat. Great. Everyone got this one right. Yeah, so it's unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. And then our third question here is, here we go. This fat is found in hydrogenated oils. So this fat is found in hydrogenated oils. Omega-3, omega-6, saturated, unsaturated, or trans fat. Just giving a moment for everyone to answer. So it looks like everyone got this one correct. It is trans fat. And again, we will talk about trans fat in more detail after we've gone through a bit more material. And I'll move on to our next question. So number 4, these fats are linked with health concerns. So omega-3 and 6, or saturated fats, unsaturated fats, trans fats, or saturated and trans fats. And I can see that, again, everyone was correct here. So saturated and trans fats are both linked with health concerns. Our next question, this fat is found in large amounts in food of animal origin, palm oil, and coconut oil. So I apologize there for this slight delay. There we go. So which fat is found in large amounts in foods of animal origin, palm oil, and coconut oil? So which one do we find in large amounts? So I've got a couple answers here. So the answer that we're looking for is saturated fat in large amounts. We find saturated fats in like bacon or, different cuts of meat, palm oil, and coconut oil for sure. And we'll talk about coconut oil a bit later on as well. So number 6, it's recommended to eat fish because it's a good source of this essential fat. So pop up that question there for you. So which essential fat is very prevalent in fish? Oh, nice. Yeah, omega-3s. That's the answer I was looking for. And number 7, this essential fat is found in most vegetable oils. So the key words here are essential fat, found in vegetable oils. Great. So I see that we've got a couple omega-6s and an unsaturated fat. So omega-6 is an essential fat, and we'll talk more about what that means later, but it's also an unsaturated fat. So if you said unsaturated fat, you're not wrong. It's a type of unsaturated fat, but that's the broader category. So not all unsaturated fats are an essential fat found in vegetable oil, but we're talking specifically about omega-6 in this case. But technically, you're not wrong if you said unsaturated fat. And the last one is this fat is found in avocado. So omega-3, omega-6, saturated, unsaturated, or trans fat. Just waiting a moment for all the answers in. This was the final question, by the way. Now you really know how to use the polling function. Lots of practice. So for this question in particular, I was looking for unsaturated fat. In general, we're talking about unsaturated fat here, but avocados also have some omega-3 fats. But from a broader standpoint, they're a good source of unsaturated fat. So moving forward from that, it's really just to get a good almost icebreaker of the material and just to give me a feel for what you guys already know. So we're going to move forward. I want to ask you guys, after all of that, another question. You can just throw it out there in the chat, but what is fat in terms of food, in terms of nutrition? What is fat? And I did kind of pave a small way. So I'm going to kick it off. Yeah, it's an energy source. That's really great. Thanks, Maya. So it's one of 3 macronutrients, as mentioned slightly before. So we've got fat, carbohydrate, and protein. And then it's also a really necessary part of our diet. It's something that we need, and I'll explain why. And it provides us with energy. It's a really energy-dense macronutrient. And fat is not all bad. So, you hear the term fat and people think, stay away from it, but it's actually not all bad. So let's unpack these a little bit more. So fat is a concentrated way to store energy. Carbohydrate and protein, the other 2 macronutrients, only contain 4 calories per gram, while fat stores 9 calories per gram. So it's over double of the other 2 macronutrients. And fat allows us to store energy without a lot of bulk. So if we only stored bulky glycogen molecules, which are made from carbohydrate, we need to be as big as the Michelin Man to store much energy. On the other hand, Even a really slender person can store enough energy in just fat to fuel a marathon. So it's really an efficient way to store energy in a smaller space. And we need fat in our diet. It makes food taste good. It helps absorb vitamins and other plant chemicals or phytonutrients that are associated with health. So a great example is beta carotene, which is the orange color from carrots and melons, orange peppers. So the fat-soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K, and they require us to have fat as part of our diet in order for them to be best absorbed into our body and be utilized. So it's very important that we're eating fat in our diet so that those vitamins can be best used. Fat also serves as a building block for hormones. And it digests slowly, so it keeps us from getting hungry. It helps to keep you full for longer. Finally, it definitely helps make your food taste better, and it helps us to enjoy our meals by giving it a nice texture or a nice flavor. And we're gonna move on with that baseline of what fat is, why it's important. We're gonna talk about cholesterol. It's often a topic that's really closely tied with fat, and it's really important to have a good understanding of what cholesterol is and what we mean when we're talking about cholesterol before we talk about more details of fat. And cholesterol is essentially a fat-like substance. It's a waxy substance that we are required to have in our body. We need some cholesterol to function. And all animal cells produce cholesterol because it's an essential component of the cell structure. So because of that, certain foods are sources of cholesterol. So for example, one food that everyone seems to know about is eggs. Eggs do have a fair amount of cholesterol. However, when we consume cholesterol in our food, it does not affect our blood cholesterol levels. And those cholesterol levels in your blood are what's important when we're talking about health. We want lower levels of blood cholesterol. But it's important to know that when we consume food that does have cholesterol, like eggs or shrimp, it really doesn't have a big effect on the levels of cholesterol in your blood. And what does have an effect on your blood cholesterol is triglycerides, which are a type of fat. So whenever we eat, our bodies are going to convert any calories that they don't need to use right away into triglycerides, which are stored in our fat cells. And a triglyceride is basically just biochemically, 3 fatty acids stuck to a glycerol molecule. And you just need to know triglycerides are a type of fat. So when we consume triglycerides, they're converted into cholesterol in your body, and that's what affects your blood cholesterol. And so you don't necessarily need to avoid cholesterol if it says cholesterol on the food label. So that's something that's really great to be mindful of when we're talking about cholesterol and blood cholesterol. So now we're going to talk about LDL versus HDL. I hope you like my little pictures to help give you an idea. So it's important to go over exactly what we mean when we talk about LDL and HDL cholesterol. Thanks, Maya. So basically what they mean, they're not actually cholesterol. However, they're often referred to as cholesterol. They're lipoproteins. So LDL stands for low density lipoprotein, and HDL stands for high density lipoprotein. And basically, they're carriers. They carry cholesterol through our body, but they're not actually the same as cholesterol. A really common analogy are the devil and angel. So as you can see, HDL would be the angel, and then LDL would be considered the devil. One's the good kind, one's the bad kind. And it's often how it's portrayed, and it's not necessarily wrong. LDL, so the devil, the bad one, it carries cholesterol to our body's cells. And that's not necessarily always bad because, as I mentioned, we do need a certain amount of cholesterol in order for our bodies to function properly. But we also don't need too much of it, because if we get too high levels of cholesterol, it's going to lead to an increased risk of heart disease. So if we have too high levels of LDL, then our cholesterol is going to build up in our cells, and that can lead to an increased risk for heart disease and stroke and things along those lines. On the other hand, HDL, the good one, or the angel, it actually absorbs cholesterol and brings it back to the liver so it can be removed from the body. It really has the opposite function of LDL. So if we have more of the HDL, then we'll actually find that our blood cholesterol levels will decrease. And so if we have those high levels of HDL, then we find that we have a decreased risk for heart disease. So you can just think of it, HDL, it's the happy, H for happy, and L is for low, right? And that's the back and forth roles that these two lipoproteins play and how they're connected to our diet and to cholesterol. So on that note, another really key point is something called atherosclerosis, which is just a big word that means a buildup of plaque in your blood vessels, to put it quite simply. So too much cholesterol in your blood can actually build up on the walls of your blood vessels, as shown here, and it results in what we commonly know as plaque. And over time, plaque can build up and narrow your blood vessels, and that's going to limit the amount of blood that can flow through your vessels, and that in turn limits the amount that goes to our cells, our heart, our brain. And we know that that's bad because we need our blood to flow through our body in a specific amount at a specific rate in order to deliver and supply oxygen and all the nutrients that our cells need. So it's really important that we have enough blood flowing through our vessels. Because if we don't, it can actually result in a heart attack or a stroke. And that's the connection between cholesterol and heart disease. So too much LDL, or the low density lipoprotein that's delivering cholesterol to our cells, it will be too high and our body won't know what to do with that. So it can result in a heart attack or stroke. And here are just is a graphic to show you the progressive stages of atherosclerosis and how a buildup over time can limit blood flow and lead to higher blood pressure and or a potential blood clot. And often when you get your blood tested, the doctor will check your HDL and LDL levels to make sure that you have a good balance of each. It's also interesting and beneficial to note that if you make changes to your diet, you can reverse your levels of HDL and LDL and bring back some balance to help prevent further, buildup of plaque in the vessels. However, the actual plaque buildup is very hard to reverse. It's mostly these changes in your diet are going to help prevent furthering the amount of plaque. So that's some good news. And it's now that we have a good understanding of cholesterol in our foods versus blood cholesterol that is caused by triglycerides, and then the roles of those LDL and HDL carriers, we can move forward with fats, okay? Because we're going to build on that. So this slide might look a little intimidating for me. I'm like, oh my goodness, look at all this chemistry. But we're thinking broad, big picture here. So the three main types of fats, we did discuss them during the Test Your Knowledge segment. So we've got saturated fat, unsaturated fat, and trans fat here. We know that saturated fat is solid at room temperature and unsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature. Then we have trans fat, and for the most part, it's fairly solid at room temperature, but sometimes it's not as solid as saturated fat. It's weird, right? So if we look, we can see that saturated fat is a fairly straight line of hydrogens and carbons. And the intent of this slide is just to show you why these different types of fats are solid or liquid at room temperature. So if we build these molecules of saturated fats on top of each other, they can be packed in really nicely. And that's how you get them solid at room temperature, because it's really tight and close together when we're at room temperature. Whereas unsaturated fat to the right, we can see that there's a kink in the shape. So I think of it like a little lightning bolt. And that's because they have this double bond. And in this case, it's called a cis double bond. It just means that if you try to layer them up on top of each other, there would be spaces in between, and it's really difficult to get them lumped close together. So that is what explains why they're liquid at room temperature. So things like oils, like olive oil, liquid at room temperature. And then we've got trans fat at the bottom. It's made more solid at room temperature. So you've essentially taken a liquid fat and manually created it to be more solid. So you can see there's only a little bit of a kink. It's much less of a kink than the unsaturated fat, and the fat has been chemically modified to make it more solid. So that's why during the test your knowledge, technically we're looking for saturated. You can see now chemically that those trans fat have a tiny little double bond in there, so they're a tiny bit kinked. And those are the chemical structures behind why certain fats take a certain shape at room temperature, and it gives a good foundation moving forward. So we'll start with unsaturated fat here. It's known as the healthier type of fat. And if we think back to what was explained about HDL, the good, and LDL, the bad, HDL is the good lipoprotein or good cholesterol, and we see increases in that good cholesterol when we consume unsaturated fats, which is positive. And in some cases, we can actually see a decrease in the LDL or the bad cholesterol with these unsaturated fats. So this is the type of fat that can be kind of like a double agent. It increases the good, decreases the bad. So if you're worried about your blood cholesterol levels, you would want to focus on consuming unsaturated fats as your source of fat, because it's the best way to help rebalance those levels of blood cholesterol in the way that we want to have them. And it's liquid at room temperature. I feel like I've said that about 5 times now, so you'll never forget, but you already knew it in the first place. But so it just means that any type of oil that you can pretty much imagine is a type of unsaturated fat. Fish also has unsaturated fat, and so does avocado. They're solid, but the fat part of the structures of these foods is a liquid. It's just mixed in with the other parts of the food that make it a solid. It's the same thing with nuts and seeds. So for example, you can buy almond or avocado oil, and that's the liquid part that's been removed from the food. And these are the healthiest types of fat, and they do a really good job at increasing the health of your cardiovascular system, so your heart and lungs, in your blood vessels, and it helps to prevent further plaque buildup and ultimately prevents heart attack and stroke. So this is exactly what we mean when we say fat is not all bad. It's a perfect example of why we need to consume fat. If we did not consume these things, we would not get the benefits that it brings for us. And it's really important to focus on this type of fat for our health. Digging a little bit deeper, unsaturated fats can be divided down into monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. And those names come from the chemical structures of those fats. So basically, mono means that there's only one double bond in that kink, and then poly means that there's more double bonds. Many, poly means many. It really doesn't matter though, you don't have to memorize that. Both have positive effects on your cholesterol and your heart health. So we want to include both poly and mono unsaturated fats in a healthy, balanced diet. It's commonly heard that most of the fats that we consume should come from monounsaturated fats. About 2/3 is usually what's being recommended, and that's because they have an even higher health benefit, but both are really good. So according to dietitians, it's not entirely recommended to try to take one more than the other. It's just good to focus on including both in a healthy diet. So some sources of monounsaturated fats include olive oil. That one has probably the highest level of monounsaturated fat, and that's why it's commonly recommended by dietitians. Also peanut oil, canola oil, sesame oil, really tasty, avocados or avocado oil, non-hydrogenated margarine, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about trans fat. It's almost always non-hydrogenated in Canada, which is a good thing. It means it has a lot of monounsaturated fats. And most nuts and seeds also have monounsaturated fats. Moving over to polyunsaturated fats, great sources would be corn oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, soybean oil, fish, cottonseed oil, any type of fish, particularly the fattier fish. And most nuts and seeds also have polyunsaturated fats. And these poly fats include omega-3 and omega-6, which are essential fats. And both are really great fats for our heart health. So what do I mean when I talk about essential fats? That was mentioned in the quiz a little bit. So unsaturated fats are basically an essential fat is an unsaturated fat. So it's a good type of fat, but it cannot be made in our bodies. Unfortunately, other types of fat our bodies are really great at making, but these types of fat we have to get from food. There's no way to have them unless we consume them in our diet. And they're very important for a lot of metabolic processes. So it's pretty significant that we consume foods that have these essential fats. And the two that we're talking about are omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. It's not so much important to remember the type of omega-3 and omega-6 fat, as long as you know that it's important to consume both. That's really what you should take away, because sometimes it can be really hard to narrow which ones you're getting. As long as you're eating foods with sources of those two types of fats, you're also going to be getting your essential fats. So some sources of omega-3 fatty acids are fatty fish. So again, just moving backwards, of unsaturated fats, we've got the mono and we've got the polyunsaturated. Omega-3 and omega-6 are types of polyunsaturated fats. And omega-3s, a really great source, and the big ones would be salmon, Arctic char, mackerel, anchovies, trout, and sardines. Also, flaxseed is a really great source, but they have to be ground, because sometimes people just buy full flaxseed and sprinkle them on everything, but the outer part of the seed is so solid that our bodies can't actually get to the fat in the middle unless we grind them up. So make sure that you buy, ground flaxseed, or you grind up your flaxseed so that we can get to the good part in the middle. And then also walnuts, canola oil, soybean oil, tofu, and fortified foods like margarine or juice, yogurt, sometimes eggs, they have omega-3 added to them. Some sources of omega-6 fatty acids, vegetable oils like safflower, sunflower, soybean, and corn, walnuts, other nuts and seeds, and sometimes we can get it from meat, poultry, and fish. And there are many sources, so there are a lot of different ways that you can get these essential fats, which is really great because we need them. Of the two, typically omega-3 is a little bit more difficult for people to consume, just because fish is the best source and not everyone eats fish. So the recommendation is to consume fish 2 to 3 times per week in order to make sure you're getting a lot of omega-3, but not everyone likes to eat fish, or maybe you're a vegetarian, so you might need to get a little bit creative. So good ideas would be to grind some flaxseed and sprinkle them on meals, or add it to your smoothies, your cereal, salads, eating more nuts and seeds, put them in your meals, add them to some vegetables, some yogurt, eating fortified foods. So if you don't eat fish, it might be worth including those other types of foods just mentioned into your diet, because really the best way is through fish. But if you're not eating any fish, then it might be something worth paying attention to. Does anyone have questions? That's the first time I've asked you, but does anyone have any questions so far? No, good to go. All right, we'll move forward with some saturated fats. So in terms of what this one does for our health, and specifically our heart health, saturated fat unfortunately does increase the LDL, or the bad cholesterol in our bodies. And that's the part of consuming saturated fat that's not ideal, because it leads to an increase in that bad cholesterol. So it's, as we mentioned, it's solid at room temperature. So when you think about a fatty or a marbled steak, or like a pork chop, that would be saturated fat. And some dairy has saturated fat unless it's fat-free dairy. And examples of, those products that have that saturated fat would be butter, yogurt, milk, cheese, things like that. Now, another source of saturated fat is coconut oil. And it's a bit strange that coconut oil went through this big kind of hype, right? There was a period where it was it was given a health halo, essentially. But no one was really talking about the fact that coconut oil is a saturated fat. And we know this by using our test that it's solid at room temperature, not really in the middle of the summer, but it only becomes liquid when it's heated. And it's not necessarily the case that it's this great magical cure for ailments. There are certain benefits that we get from coconut oil, but also that we have certain benefits for consuming meat sources of saturated fats. Similar to that, it's not recommended to avoid it altogether, just important to recognize that coconut oil is a source of saturated fat, and that means it can increase your risk of LDL cholesterol. So it really all comes down to, again, consuming foods in moderation and just being aware of what the effects that they have on your body are and making decisions based on that. Just know that if you're looking for the healthiest types of fats, focus more on unsaturated fats, but you don't have to cut saturated fats out altogether. And here's a chart that shows how much saturated fat is in different types of commonly eaten foods. Now, not if you're a vegetarian. The first one is meat. So T-bone steak, a pork shoulder, or sausage meat. Very high saturated fat content. And just pay mind to the serving size here, 4 ounces. Most steaks at a restaurant are 7 ounces. So you're definitely eating more saturated fat than what's shown here. Next, cheese at 32% milk fat. It's 10 grams of saturated fat, right? Unless it's fat-free, of course. Butter follows, 2 teaspoons of butter is 5 grams of saturated fat. And then we've got certain types of beef or pork tenderloin have less fat than what was mentioned in the first row there. Chicken, if most of the saturated fat is in the skin of chicken, so if you're buying skinless, boneless chicken breast, you're probably getting very little saturated fat. Maya, should I continue? It's just you and I. Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay, so sorry for anyone who's listening. We'll continue. Right, so moving forward. And then we've got non-hydrogenated margarine, very little saturated fat. As mentioned earlier, it's mostly unsaturated, which is healthy. And then fish and legumes have very little. Most sources are really not too high, except for those really fatty meats like sausage meat. Lastly, we've got trans fat. So this is the one that we should be avoiding altogether. The good news is that we don't really have to worry about it in Canada because it was banned, and producers can no longer add trans fat in foods as of September 2018. And that's a fairly new regulation, and we're still in the process of phasing it in. So there still might be some products that were produced or manufactured before September 2018 that have long shelf lives, and they may have trans fat in them, but anything made after that time can no longer have any amounts of trans fats added to them. In terms of what trans fat is, it's mostly a man-made chemical structure. So they've taken that liquid fat and made it into a more solid fat so that it can be more easily added to foods like donuts or other baked goods. And that's really not a natural thing. It was done thinking that it was really great because it tastes good and does really great things to food. It adds texture, but it turns out it does things that are quite detrimental to our health. When we talk about trans fat, it does the same thing that saturated fat does. It increases the LDL, or the bad cholesterol, and it also decreases the HDL, which is the good cholesterol. So it does both of the bad things that we don't want. It's basically the opposite to unsaturated fat, which does both of the good things that we do want. There's really no need for us to be using trans fat because it was a man-made product to begin with. It's not necessary. It doesn't need to be part of our diet, and that's why Health Canada made the decision to ban it from our products. There are, on that note, some foods that naturally do contain trans fats. And for the most part, these fall under the categories of dairy and meat. They have some, but not the same type and of detrimental effects as the man-made ones have on your health. And usually in such small amounts, they're present, so you don't really need to worry about it. And another thing that trans fat was commonly used in was margarine. Margarine used to be made of trans fats or partially hydrogenated oils, and now we see margarine with non-hydrogenated oils. So it's using more natural oils rather than the man-made trans fats. So that's really, really great. And we're going to move forward with a comparison of dietary fats here. So to orient you to this photo, essentially, it's a breakdown of different types of oils and butter and lard to show you the breakdown and the constituents of how much saturated fat and how much unsaturated fats each contain. So essentially, the red means saturated, so the bad type of fat that we want to limit. And then blue, dark yellow, and bright yellow are all unsaturated fats that we want to get more of in our diets. So just some examples quick here. Safflower and olive oils are highest in the monounsaturated fats, which is the main reason why they're so popular. It's the best type of fat you can have for your health. Just a note here, health effects of oil do not change with heat. The concern is that you're aware of the smoke point of each oil. So that just means which temperature the oil will start to burn or to smoke. So you can, that information is definitely available online. You can check out smoke points of different oils for when you're cooking with them. And every oil has some of every type of fat. So that's a really big takeaway point for this illustration. They're not, just one exclusively unsaturated or exclusively saturated. So it's not as simple as saying all oils are unsaturated fats and animal fats are saturated, because they all contain some of each. It's really about which sources have more of saturated and unsaturated, and that's how we categorize them. I will pass out a handout. I'll give you a handout here for, whoops. I'm just trying to see, I'll share it now, but I'm not sure if it can be added if the video is uploaded, but you don't have to download it, Maya. Okay, so moving on to, I'm not sure if the handout, okay, perfect. So that's just a copy of the dietary fats comparison, and it's also available online. You just Google comparison of dietary fats. For those who are watching, if this is a recording. So I'm just gonna leave you with some guidelines moving forward. So it's recommended to consume 65 grams a day or less of unsaturated fats, and that's a fairly easy goal to achieve. What's important to note is to make sure that you're having less than 20 grams of saturated or trans fats every day. Trans fats is a little easier for us to avoid as Canadians because they're banned. Saturated fats will be shown on the nutrition labels of foods, and you want to try to have at least 3 to 6 teaspoons of unsaturated fats in order to reach optimal heart health, because it increases your LDL and lowers your HDL cholesterol. Or sorry, it increases your HDL and lowers your LDL cholesterols. And remember that some foods have naturally occurring fats in them already, so you don't always have to be adding oils to all your foods. And when you're choosing foods, read the nutrition labels and look for 3 grams of fat per serving or less. And also another tip is to look for 2 grams or less of saturated or trans fats, this is the most important to focus on. It's more important to focus on this than focusing on overall fat, okay? And then finally, looking for 8% or less of the daily value of fat per serving. Here is just applying our knowledge. So if I'm looking at 2 labels for 2 different types of yogurt, which one would we choose based on the fat? Not looking at any of the other constituents, just focusing on fat. We can see yogurt A has total fat of 2 grams and yogurt B on the right has total fat of 4.5 grams. But let's look a little deeper underneath. It breaks it down into how much saturated and trans fats are in each yogurt. So in yogurt A, we see that there's 1.5 grams of saturated fat. And then in yogurt B, we see that there's 3 grams of saturated fat. So based on that information, which yogurt would you choose? Maya? So we would definitely go for yogurt A because it has significantly less saturated fat, and they both have 0 trans fat, which is great because you want as little trans fat as possible. But yogurt A has half the saturated fat, so we would go for that one. And moving forward, great takeaways. Basically, you want to choose foods with unsaturated fats as much as possible, like fish, nuts, seeds, plant oils, and non-hydrogenated margarine. And finishing with our last poll, I will add it here for you, Maya. I feel that I can apply what I learned today in my daily living. So just answer to the best of your ability. Agree. Perfect. So I will provide you with some really great nutrition resources here if you'd like to explore. I'm just going to add you. Sorry for the wait. I'm just providing a JPEG of the slide. So if you wish, you can check out these really great nutrition resources, meal planning, different ideas for snacks, and a lot of the information I shared with you is available on these websites. And then we've got a few other resources provided by HQ and that we use in a lot of our other workshops here. And great, we've got 6 minutes for questions if you have any. So thank you so much for joining today. I hope that it was very helpful and useful for you. And thanks for taking the time. Stay healthy. Thanks, Maya, for sticking around. I'm going to end the session. Have a lovely day.